They came at dawn, their boots sinking into wet red clay, their voices sharp as the metal chains they dragged behind. The air was thick with the sound of orders shouted like thunder, but beneath it all there was the trembling of a heartbeat. A family's home being erased. The world had taught them to expect loss, but not like this. Maya stood still, gripping a crumpled envelope in her hand, watching strangers label her memories property. Elijah's jaw locked. Chloe's tears traced through dust on her cheeks. A crowd gathered, phones up, silence heavy. The city called it procedure. But whose history do they bulldoze when they call it progress? And how many homes must fall before someone calls it theft? The dust still hung in the air hours after the machines were gone, like grief that refused to settle. The street was quiet now, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that came after something sacred had been broken. They sat on the curb, surrounded by what used to be their lives. A cracked picture frame, a torn Bible, a doll missing one arm. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed ashamed to pass through. Maya's fingers traced the faint outline of where the porch once stood, and her lips trembled between prayer and disbelief. Elijah stared into the distance, his thoughts running faster than he could catch them. Chloe leaned against her mother, eyes red, but still searching the ground as if pieces of their home might reappear. Somewhere inside that silence, something shifted. Not hope, not yet, but the quiet promise that they would not disappear as easily as their house had. By morning, the story had already become headlines. Family evicted after years of dispute. Words written by people who had never seen their faces, who didn't know the creak in those old floors, or the smell of rain through cracked windows. News trucks crowded the block, turning grief into spectacle. Strangers arrived with sympathy, cameras, and questions, but no answers. Maya kept her head low, speaking softly, refusing to perform her pain for the lens. Elijah said nothing at all. His silence was louder than any protest. Chloe watched them from the car, her reflection trapped between the glass and the world outside. They were no longer a family in the city's eyes. They were a story, stripped of their names, their dignity repackaged into headlines that would fade by nightfall. That night they slept in their car, parked behind an abandoned church. The world outside hummed with indifference. The city lights blinked, traffic roared. Life went on. But inside the car, the air was thick with exhaustion and whispers. Chloe asked softly if they would ever go home again. Maya's answer came slow. A trembling, nice, meant more for comfort than truth. Elijah stared out the windshield, eyes fixed on nothing. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then steady, tapping against the roof like a heartbeat. The sound filled the silence they couldn't bear to break. Maya reached for Elijah's hand, and for a brief moment the storm outside didn't matter. They had lost everything but each other, and somehow that had to be enough, even when it wasn't. By dawn, exhaustion gave way to resolve. Maya rose first, stepping out into the cold morning air. Her bare feet met the wet pavement, and for a moment she stood there, letting the wind dry her tears. Elijah joined her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as Chloe slowly climbed out, clutching her backpack. They had nowhere to go. But something in Maya's eyes had changed. A quiet fire, the kind born from too much loss to fear anything else. Across the street, an elderly neighbor placed a small bag of food on their hood and whispered, "Don't give up." The words settled deep. Small but powerful. They gathered their things and began to walk, toward nothing certain, but toward something that still belonged to them, the will to fight back. The city had already moved on, but somewhere miles away, a man watched the footage on his laptop, pausing, rewinding, staring into the eyes of the woman who refused to leave her porch. Raymond Westbrook had seen injustice before, but something about that house, that family, stirred something deeper. He couldn't name it yet, but it felt personal. The Carter's small brick home appeared in the background of an old photograph lying on his desk. A photo from his father's real estate files, dated decades ago. His hand trembled as he placed the two images side by side. Different years. Same house, same land. The past had finally come calling, and this time it had a face he could no longer ignore. He couldn't sleep that night. The more he searched, the more he found. Files, deeds, signatures, and missing names. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, sealed under the company his father once owned. Each document felt like a confession written in ink and greed. Raymond leaned back in his chair, the city skyline glowing behind him. He had built his fortune on rebuilding what others destroyed, but now he wondered, how much of it had been stolen first? He thought of that family again. Their eyes, their silence, the way they stood even as the world took everything. Maybe redemption wasn't about giving money. Maybe it was about returning what never shove, then take. Morning came with a plan. Raymond called his driver and told him to take the long route through the old district, the part the city pretended didn't exist anymore. The streets were cracked, lined with fading murals and boarded-up shops. Yet under the decay, there was history, stories buried but not gone. When the car slowed near a pile of rubble, he knew it instantly. The Carter home. Only a broken mailbox stood upright, bent but still holding a name half covered in dust. He stepped out, the air thick with silence. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a witness to theft, to survival, to a truth he could no longer unsee. He spent hours walking that street. Neighbors watched quietly, unsure who he was or why his car looked so out of place among boarded homes. Raymond knocked on a door, then another, asking questions that made people wary. Finally, an old man sitting on a porch told him everything. How the land had been black-owned for generations, how the city used false tax claims to seize it, how those who resisted were erased from public records. The old man's voice cracked when he said, "They took everything, but not our memory?" Raymond nodded, his eyes wet. He realized that what he held wasn't charity or pity. It was evidence, and maybe, if he used it right, it could be justice. By evening, the old man's story played in Raymond's head on repeat. He drove back to his office, locked the door, and laid every piece of paper across the floor. Deeds, maps, signatures, lies. In the middle of it all, he found what he was searching for. An original deed dated 1949, marked with the Carter family name. It had never been transferred legally, only stolen and hidden under corporate acquisitions. His breath caught. The city had buried generations beneath paperwork, but not anymore. As the skyline outside turned orange with sunset, Raymond picked up the deed, knowing exactly what he needed to do next. He would find them, and he would return what was theirs. The next morning, Raymond drove straight to the county records office. He moved through marble hallways lined with portraits of men who had written the city's laws and erased others' lives. Behind the counter, a clerk greeted him with the kind of politeness reserved for people who didn't ask hard questions. But Raymond did. He laid the Carter deed on the counter, its fragile paper shaking slightly in his hand. The clerk's eyes widened, then darted away. Records were missing, files are classified. He'd heard those words before. Power had its own language, one that always sounded like confusion but meant control. Raymond felt a quiet fury building inside, the kind that doesn't shout, but promises not to stop until truth is heard. When the clerk refused to help, he took matters into his own hands. That night, Raymond met a journalist, one who had covered the eviction but smelled something bigger. They sat in a quiet diner, the kind with flickering neon lights and coffee that burned the tongue. She listened, taking notes as he laid out every document, every map, every missing name. Her voice softened as she said, "You realize this isn't just one family. It's dozens." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking deep. They planned to go public, but first they needed the Carters. They needed the faces behind the history, Because truth without people was just paper. Kendra found them first. She tracked the Carters to a temporary shelter on the outskirts of the city, a place crowded with quiet faces and plastic cots. When she arrived, Maya was folding clothes beside her daughter, trying to keep some order in the chaos. Elijah looked up as Kendra introduced herself, unsure whether to hope or fear. She told them about Raymond, about the deed, about proof that their land had been stolen decades ago. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Maya whispered, "You mean, it's ours?" Her voice cracked, equal parts disbelief and prayer. That one word, ours, hung in the air like light breaking through clouds. Marshani, Hugh, and Mukong, Saudi, Shores. When Raymond met them, he didn't speak right away. He stood at the doorway of that shelter, a man of power surrounded by poverty, unsure if he even belonged in their story. Maya looked at him, not with gratitude, but with quiet suspicion. She had seen men like him before, men who came to fix things for their own conscience. But then he unfolded the deed, the paper fragile as skin, and placed it in her hands. "This belongs to you," he said softly. Elijah stepped closer, his face unreadable, his breath caught between anger and disbelief. For a moment, no one moved. Then Maya's hands began to shake, not from fear, but from recognition. The news broke the next day. Photos of the Carters holding the deed spread like wildfire. Raymond's name filled the headlines. Some called him a hero, others a traitor to his class. The city scrambled to defend itself, but the documents spoke louder than press releases. The Carters didn't seek fame. They just wanted their home. As reporters crowded outside the shelter, Maya said only one thing: "We never left. They just tried to erase us." Her words echoed across screens and living rooms, through neighborhoods that had forgotten their stories. And for the first time, the world began to listen. You see, the city council chamber smelled like new paint and old lies. Rows of cameras filled the back, their lenses hungry for spectacle. Raymond sat beside the Carters, their quiet strength cutting through the noise of whispers and shifting papers. Across the table sat the council, polished, rehearsed, pretending fairness. Councilwoman Diane Brooks looked uneasy, her hands clasped too tightly to seem calm. Raymond stood, unfolding the original deed like a weapon wrapped in truth. The room stilled. "This land," he said, voice steady, "was never yours to take." The words dropped like stones into still water, rippling through power and privilege. Maya watched them flinch, not at the truth, but at the cameras that could no longer ignore it. The council tried to twist the narrative. They spoke of legal procedure, of zoning laws, and technical oversights. Each word felt like another wall being rebuilt in real time. Raymond countered calmly, presenting document after document, dates aligning like puzzle pieces. The Carters said little. Their silence was its own power. Then Maya rose. She didn't shout. She simply said, "We're not asking for a favor. We're asking for what's ours." The room fell still. Even the cameras paused, as if language itself needed a moment to breathe. Truth didn't need volume. It only needed courage. And hers was louder than any gavel. By midday, the hearing turned into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs cracked through the air, and whispers spread like wildfire. Someone leaked an internal memo, proof that the city had intentionally seized Black-owned properties for redevelopment. The council tried to adjourn, but it was too late. Raymond looked at Diane, their eyes meeting across the room. Her guilt was visible now, raw and human. Maya reached for Elijah's hand beneath the table, steadying herself. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about every family erased for profit. The truth was no longer buried. It was televised. Hours later, the city was on fire. Not with flames, but with outrage. News anchors replayed the footage on loop. Protesters filled the streets, holding signs that read, "Give back what you stole." For the first time, the Carters weren't alone. Strangers, young, old, rich, poor, stood beside them. Raymond watched from the crowd, the sound of chants echoing through downtown streets. Somewhere near the courthouse, Maya held her daughter's hand tight. Chloe looked up and whispered, "They're fighting for us?" Maya smiled faintly, eyes wet. "No, baby," she said softly. "They're fighting with us." Later that night, Councilwoman Brooks held a press conference. Her voice trembled as she read a statement, part apology, part confession. She spoke of corruption, of developers, of policies dressed as progress that had stolen generations of black wealth. Cameras clicked like thunder. When she looked up, her eyes found Maya's in the crowd. No words passed between them, but something did. Acknowledgement, sorrow, maybe redemption. Afterward, as lights dimmed and people began to leave, Maya stood still, holding the deed close. The city was finally listening, but she knew the hardest part wasn't proving they were wrong. It was rebuilding what they destroyed. The city woke up different. News vans lined the courthouse, headlines screamed of corruption and theft. What began as one family's fight had turned into a movement. Elijah watched from a diner window as strangers wore shirts with their name printed in bold. Maya still didn't believe in miracles, but she did believe in truth. And now, it was spreading. Raymond's phone buzzed non-stop with calls from lawyers, activists, and mayors who suddenly remembered compassion. But it wasn't about politics anymore. It was about every grandmother who lost her house, every father who worked himself to the bone for a deed that never meant anything to those in power. The Carters' pain had become proof, and proof could not be buried anymore. Officer Haynes couldn't hide anymore. His badge, once a shield, had become a spotlight. Videos surfaced, the eviction, his commands, the disregard in his voice. Reporters camped outside his house. The same uniform that made him proud now weighed like guilt stitched into fabric. He watched the news replay Maya's trembling hands holding that deed, and something inside him cracked. It wasn't remorse, exactly, but recognition of how easily cruelty becomes normal when someone tells you it's the law. That night, he walked into the precinct, placed his badge on the desk, and left without looking back. The system had taken enough. It wouldn't take his soul, too. The protests grew louder, spreading from Atlanta to other cities. Marches filled the news, but this time people weren't demanding charity. They were demanding restitution. Maya spoke at one rally, her voice trembling at first, then rising with conviction. She didn't talk about pain, she talked about legacy. About land that holds memory. Elijah stood beside her, hand over his heart, as Chloe filmed it all on her phone, the crowd chanting their name. Raymond stood at the back, face calm, almost humble. He knew he'd started something he could no longer control, and that was the point. This wasn't his story anymore. It belonged to them. Behind the scenes, the city scrambled to cover itself. Investigations opened, resignations poured in. And the mayor called for reform committees no one believed in. But one thing changed. People started asking questions. Churches hosted meetings about generational wealth. Students researched their grandparents' land. The truth spread like wildfire through quiet conversations and kitchen tables. Meanwhile, Raymond worked to establish a fund to restore stolen Black-owned properties, naming it after the Carters. When he told Maya she didn't thank him, she just nodded and said, "Make sure it lasts longer than guilt." He smiled faintly. For once, wealth was finally being used to return, not to take. Weeks later, a press release confirmed it. The Carters' land was officially reinstated under their name. Maya cried quietly, not from relief, but from the memory of what it cost. Elijah stood in the doorway, the same place he once watched bulldozers tear through. Chloe ran through the empty lot, laughing, her sneakers splashing through puddles left by yesterday's rain. The ground still smelled of dust and smoke, but it was theirs again. Raymond arrived without reporters, handing Maya a small box. Inside, the original key to their home. She held it like a relic. Eyes wet, voice soft. "You found what they tried to bury," she whispered. He smiled. "No," he said. "You did." Months passed, and the sound of hammers replaced the memory of bulldozers. Where there had once been rubble, the Carter home began to rise again. Brick by brick, nail by nail, history being rewritten with every swing. Neighbors came by with food, laughter, and stories that had survived through whispers. Maya watched from the sidewalk, her heart swelling as walls took shape. Elijah worked alongside builders, his hands steady, sweat mixing with gratitude. Chloe painted names of ancestors on the foundation before the floorboards covered them, a promise that no one would forget again. Raymond visited often but never stayed long. He said the sound of rebuilding spoke louder than any speech he could give. When the roof finally went up, the entire neighborhood gathered. Someone brought a radio. Old songs played through static, filling the air with something that felt like memory. Maya held Elijah's hand as they stood in front of the nearly finished house. It wasn't big, it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Chloe ran from room to room, shouting out what each space would be. "This one's for laughter," she yelled, spinning in circles as dust sparkled like stars around her. For the first time, Maya laughed freely. No cameras, no officials, just joy. The past was still there, but now it lived beside the future instead of inside their pain. One quiet evening, as the last workers packed up, Raymond arrived with something in his hand, an old wooden sign that once hung above the Carter porch decades ago. He found it during the restoration, weathered but still legible. Carter Residence 1949. He offered it to Maya with a gentle smile. She ran her fingers across the faded letters, eyes filling. "You can't buy history," she said softly, "but you can bring it home." Elijah nodded, helping him mount it on the porch post where it once hung. When they stepped back, the wood caught the dying light, glowing like an ember. The past had returned, not to haunt them, but to bless them. That night, they gathered around the dinner table for the first time in their rebuilt home. The walls still smelled of fresh paint. The floor creaked in places, but it was beautiful. Maya lit a candle in the center, saying softly, "For every name they tried to erase." Elijah bowed his head. Chloe whispered her grandparents' names into the flame. Outside, crickets sang under the stars, and the city that once took everything now seemed to hum with quiet respect. Raymond sat with them, uninvited but welcome, listening more than speaking. For once, no one talked about pain or injustice. They talked about tomorrow, and how good it finally felt to believe in one. Later that night, the house fell quiet. Maya stood on the porch, barefoot, watching the moonlight wash over their land. The breeze carried the smell of soil and pine, the scent of belonging. Elijah stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We made it," he whispered. "No," she said softly, eyes still on the horizon. "We're just beginning." Behind them, Chloe's laughter echoed from inside, the pure sound of a future unbroken. Raymond's car pulled away down the dark road, his headlights fading like the last chapter of an old story. The land stood still, finally at peace. For the first time in a long, long while, the ground beneath their feet felt alive again. Years later, the world still spoke their name, not as victims, but as proof that history can be rewritten. The Carter home became more than a house. It became a lesson. School buses stopped by to teach children about land, justice, and resilience. Maya spent her mornings tending to a small garden where their porch once fell, her hands digging into soil that had taken everything but still gave back. Elijah taught neighborhood kids how to build, teaching them that strength wasn't just in muscle but in patience. Chloe grew older, wiser, her voice strong at community rallies. The story that began with an eviction ended with a seed, one that kept growing, rooted in truth, watered by memory. Sometimes, Raymond visited. He never announced himself. He just drove quietly down that same street, now alive with laughter instead of dust. He'd park at the corner and watch from his car. The family, the garden, the sign that still read Carter Residence 1949. He never stayed long. The world had called him generous, but he knew better. He hadn't given them anything new. He'd only returned what had always been theirs. That knowledge brought him peace. Before leaving, he'd look once more at the porch, smile faintly and whisper, "This is how it should always been." Then he'd drive off, his reflection fading in the rearview mirror. One man changed by the truth he chose to face. Time softened the pain but never erased it. Maya kept the old deed framed on the living room wall, next to family photos spanning generations. When guests asked why she didn't hide it away, she'd say, "Because the paper that broke us is the same one that freed us." Chloe carried that strength into her own future. Studying law, determined to protect what her family once lost. Elijah planted a tree beside the porch, saying it would outlive them all. On quiet mornings, they sat beneath it together, listening to wind brush against the leaves. The house creaked, the boards settled in peace, fragile, hard-won peace, finally stayed. On the anniversary of their return, the community gathered in the Carter's yard. Music filled the air, children danced, and elders told stories under strings of lights. Maya stood before the crowd, her voice steady, her heart full. "They tried to bury us," she said, "but they didn't know we were seeds." The audience erupted in cheers, laughter, and tears. Even Raymond was there, standing near the back, clapping quietly. For a moment, there were no rich or poor, no powerful or powerless, just people sharing space, history, and hope. The night stretched long, but no one wanted to leave. The land itself seemed to hum, alive again with voices that had always belonged. In the quiet after the celebration, Maya stood alone on the porch, her eyes tracing the outline of the horizon. She spoke softly, almost a prayer. "They built walls to erase us, but we built homes to remember." The night wind carried her words into the trees, where they mingled with laughter still echoing in the distance. She turned back toward her house, her family's lights glowing like a beacon against the dark. The camera of life pulled wide, showing not just a home, but a legacy, born from pain, raised through courage, and protected by truth. And somewhere deep in that stillness came a question only the heart could answer. How do you heal a land that tried to forget you? By never letting it forget again.